Hello everyone, and thank you for coming today. I want to extend my appreciation to the IOC for inviting me to come and speak this afternoon about change and leadership. So let me give you a whiff of what we're going to talk about. I wanted to share with you some thoughts on the nature of change itself, and then why change efforts fail. The next thing we talk about is human nature and change. And then finally, talk about change and leadership, bring it all together that way. So, what is change? It'd be helpful, I think, to think about what the nature of change itself is. So let me give you some high points of different theories and different ideas on change out there, because there are so many ways of looking at change, and there isn't just one right way of looking at change. So let's begin by looking at the nature of change and what is change. There are so many different theories of change. Almost every science, almost every discipline you can think of has a different viewpoint on change, how change impacts what they're focusing on. None of them are wrong. In fact, all of them bring insight. And in fact, today I want to bring you some glimpses and insights from various disciplines that I think help inform change efforts, and leadership in change efforts. So, we can look back to the 1940s, for example. Kurt Lewin was a theorist who came up with probably one of the best known and earliest models for change, and he called it unfreeze, change, and refreeze. It's a process. You unfreeze an organization or a culture, you make the change, and then refreeze. And that's the way he described organizational change. And you'll hear that time and again. Still today, people will refer back to Kurt Lewin in his theory. In the 1970s, and there's been a lot of other times there, but I love this one. It's called punctuated equilibrium. Now, does that sound like some kind of an academic egghead term or something a consultant would charge you a lot of money in a change consultancy gig? The answer is yes, it does. But I took this photo in this slide of a bumper sticker at University of Oklahoma. And I'm sure it was a graduate student because the car was old and beat up. But it says, honk if you understand punctuated equilibria. Punctuated equilibrium is a way of describing, well, equilibrium that suddenly is shifted because of a change. You might think of it as in California, the ground is constantly shifting. There's constantly small tremors, and people are just used to it. They don't even notice it until there is a big adjustment and there's an earthquake. And so that would be a description of punctuated equilibrium. In the 1980s, Peter Vail described something called permanent whitewater, which I think is a beautiful metaphor for the way management and leadership sciences are today. It seems like when you sit in a meeting full of old-timers in meetings, or at least more senior folk, they talk about the good old days when things moved slower, and that they had time, at Christmas time things slowed down, that kind of thing. That doesn't ever seem to happen anymore. It seems like, as Peter Vail talked about in the 1980s, we are in a period of permanent whitewater, where it is constantly going fast, and it's requiring constant vigilance. And there just doesn't seem to be a lot of downtime. Change seems to happen incrementally and radically. And so I wanted to present a few ideas on ways of looking at on a continuum, juxtaposing some ideas from a book by a fellow named Burke. It's a great textbook. There is evolutionary and revolutionary change. That's one way of describing evolutionary and revolutionary. There is continuous and discontinuous. There is episodic and continuing flow. Now, a lot of these sound the same, and in fact, they're the same conversations, just using different words. But transformational and transactional change. There's strategic and operational. Strategic would be longer-term vision, bigger picture leverage, and the operational is the more tactical. And then there's local option and total system. So, local and a systems approach, a systems view. This author put those all, kind of juxtaposed all these different things to show that there are so many different ways of looking at change. And it's really useful, it's very helpful, in fact, for professionals, for academics, for anybody, I think, in today's world to understand about change and the different ways that it can be seen, and particularly if you're going to be a leader. And by the way, I wanted to take a show of hands here. Who in here is a leader? Who thinks of themselves as a leader? This was a trick question because every hand should have been up. Every one of you is a leader. Now, you may not have a business card or a desk plate or a corner office, maybe not yet, but you are leaders of your own lives. And in many contexts of your life, you are a leader. And that will only increase over time. And you also have opportunities to take on more leadership positions. And so understanding change would be, I think, critical to that, to the success in this world of permanent whitewater. So let's pause a minute. I'd like to talk just a few moments and get your thoughts on the various kinds of change that I've just described. So next, let's look at why change efforts fail, or why a lot of them don't succeed, however you want to look at it, half empty, half full. The fact is, a lot of them don't. And so, as is my habit, I draw from so many different theories and fields. So I want to suggest Journalism 101 might be a good place to suggest why a lot of change efforts do not succeed, or they don't have the outcomes as positive as was hoped. So from the journalism field, freshmen in journalism classes will learn that it's essential for every news story to have start over again. Beginning journalism students learn, I hope on the first day, they did in my time when I was in journalism school, that there are essential elements that make a story, a news story, credible and high quality. We call them the 5 W's and the H. Can you think of what those might be? What is every news story supposed to have? Who, what, when, where, why, and how. So it was, 5 and 6, right. So who, what, when, where, why, and how are essential ingredients for a good news story. And I suggest that these are also necessary ingredients for a good change plan. For leading change, all of these ingredients need to be in there. John Cotter has written extensively. He's a Harvard professor of start over. Change effort success rates are low. John Cotter, who is probably one of the best known authors and thinkers and lecturers on change, leadership, has written extensively, and some of his works are quoted all over the world. And he, some time ago, did some research and found that about 70% of organization change efforts fail. 70% fail. And since then, other studies have been done, and they pretty much back that up. That seems to be about right. Many meticulously planned, really costly change efforts failed or did not deliver the results that were intended, and they really should have. It was not a really great ROI. So it seems like the leaders covered the what, and they covered the when and the where and the how. They're really good at saying how. Here's how you're going to do it. But it seems like, more often than not, they did not cover off the who, the stakeholders. They forgot the stakeholders. And they also didn't maybe do the why, as far as telling the stakeholders why we're doing this. Why are we doing this change thing? And so, neglecting those stakeholders, the who, and neglecting to provide with them with plausible explanations, effectively communicating to stakeholders why, they're setting themselves up for failure. So let's pause for a minute, because I'd like So let's pause for a moment, because I want to invite you to think of a change effort. It's probably easier to think of one that didn't go well, so let's start with that. Think of a change effort that did not go well, organizational change effort, I mean. And it could be a company, it could be government, it could be just about anything. You probably can come up with one that hasn't done well. But think for a minute about that, and then think a little deeper about the stakeholders. And do you have any assumptions or imaginings on when they were brought in and how involved they were in the process if it didn't go well? And I would bet you that they were not greatly involved, and probably not involved in early on in the effort at all. So let's pause a minute and talk about that. It seems that we are hardwired to resist change. I think intuitively, I'd always thought that, and I think a lot of us do too. It just seems like change is something that is difficult for so many of us. But since prehistoric times, change was viewed as an Since prehistoric times, change has been viewed as an Since prehistoric times, change has been viewed as an existential threat, or at least during those prehistoric times. Change was seldom seen as being something that was good, positive. It generally meant death, pain, misery, suffering. It could mean your food source is changing, is going away. It could mean your shelter is going to be impacted. There may be raiding hordes. There might be a saber-toothed tiger in the neighborhood. Change was a physical, existential threat. And so, of course, it triggered a fear response. Dave Gunby here in Dallas-Fort Worth is a change consultant, and he said, let me read this if I can. What the reptilian response in our brain tells us is, if it's not food or if it's not a mate, then it is an enemy and we should kill it. So our natural instinct makes us skeptical of new information. New information being, in this context, I'm talking about change. So if it's not food or a mate, then it's scary. Daniel Goleman at Harvard, who has written, he's probably one of the best known authors on emotional intelligence, has written extensively, and he says that, he calls it something called the amygdala hijack. That's another one of those other big academic terms, but bear with me. What that is in our ancient part of our brain, the amygdala, also called the lizard brain by many. It is a trigger point for distress and for impulse and for fear. I mean, it is constantly scanning the environment, and it is a radar for threats. And if it gets triggered, if it detects a threat, it takes over the whole brain. In fact, it hijacks the brain, so hence the name amygdala hijack. It causes that fight, flight, or freeze response. And there's a flood of stress hormones that take over too. Your heart starts pounding, and it's often. Yeah, I'm going to start over again on that one. Daniel Goleman at Harvard, who has written extensively on emotional intelligence. He's probably one of the most popular authors and theorists on this. In one of his books, wrote about something called the amygdala hijack, which sounds like another academic term or a consulting term. But what that means is, the amygdala is an ancient part of our brains we all have. Some people call it that lizard brain. It's this ancient part of our brains that is a trigger point for distress, for impulse, for fear. And think of it as a radar for threats. And when that threat is detected, it takes over the brain. It hijacks. It's hence the name amygdala hijack. It triggers this fight, flight, or freeze response. And we get flooded with stress hormones. And it's just really hard to think clearly at that point. Often, the amygdala makes mistakes. It didn't get the memo that things are different now. It's based on a fraction of the signals and data out there. It got triggered and it took over. That worked for millions of years when there were physical threats. But today, modern life, most dangers, most of them for us, are not physical threats. But still we overreact. We still have that amygdala hijack to take place. Sometimes change can be the thing that causes that. He writes, the top 5 workplace triggers are, first of all, condescension and lack of respect. Second is being treated unfairly. Third is being unappreciated. Fourth is feeling unheard. And the fifth is being held to unrealistic deadlines. Now, when I first read those, first thing that came to mind was change. Yeah. Would any of these be triggered by organizational change, you think? Probably would be. Probably would be. Another Harvard professor, Donna Hicks, who has written an awesome book called Dignity, the essential role and the essential role it plays in resolving conflict. She's written extensively about dignity in organizations, dignity in the workplace, and also dignity really in society. And she says that human connection is crucial for our survival. We are biologically connected. And there's all kinds of research that's really showing this to be true. We are social beings, and our survival is linked to the quality of these relationships. We are psychologically programmed to believe that our lives are dependent on being treated well. And we can't help but overreact to feeling that we're being mistreated. She talks in her book and in her writings about brain scans, where they hook the brain scans up, the sensors up to volunteers and for research, and it showed that feeling like that there was a dignity violation or our worth was being questioned, or someone was trying to diminish our worth, and a physical attack had the same kind of reaction in the brain. So whether it's our self-worth being attacked or whether we're being physically attacked, in our brains we have a similar response. Well, when change is happening in an organization or anywhere, especially if we didn't know about it, if it was a surprise, or it's being imposed on us, that could be a dignity violation, in her words, in her viewpoint, which I think I agree with. They're feeling like that they were not valuable enough or valued enough to be brought in. It's being imposed upon them. So that would be leaving the who out and also the why for the stakeholders. People tend to support what they help create. Start over again. People tend to support what they helped create. They have skin in the game. And an extension of that gambling metaphor, if you're not at the table, you're on the table. And what that means, what do you think it means? Yeah, what it means is you have a place at the table and you are a player versus being on the table as something that's being bargained over and manipulated or coerced or worse. And so from adult learning theory, here I am drawing from yet another field, because I think it's really relevant. Adult learning theory, adults learn differently, but in adult learning theory, adults have more discretion in learning. And learning in this sense of letting in new information, letting in change. And likewise, they resist imposition. Because I said so is not a very good reason. It doesn't work very well with children, and it sure doesn't work with adults who can walk. They need to know why. They want to know why. And I think you probably can relate to that. I know my early schooling experiences were not very satisfying when I had to do stuff that I had no idea why we were doing it. And it seemed so random. Had they shared, or the times they did share, here's why this is important, or here's what this does down the road, then I could be on board with that. Because I said so, or just do it, were not very satisfying. And I didn't learn as well. In fact, I kind of shut down. And that is not unlike what goes on with change. Learning for adults is very connected to their own self-interest. In fact, what do you think the world's favorite radio station is? What do you think that would be? It is, well, here's what I think it is, WII-FM. What's in it for me? WII-FM is everyone's favorite radio station because we are animals that operate out of our own self-interests, which is very normal. Taken to an extreme, well, we can see what happens when it's taken to an extreme. But when you think about it, we all operate on some level out of our own self-interest. And sometimes that's also altruistic and generous. But we get good feelings from that. So remembering that people need to know, that kind of getting back to here's why, and here's why we're doing this. If you can share with people, your stakeholders, here's why this is happening, why this change is being made, then you've immediately improved your chances of change. So let's stop a minute and think about some of the things we just talked about. All right, now I'd like to bring this on home and try and connect the dots here, because we've been all over. We've talked about so many different theory streams, and disciplines. Now, about leadership and change. You have a better understanding of the nature of change, I hope. Also about how people react to change, human nature and change. And then also about what gets engagement for change. So how does one lead successful and Sustainable change. And I say sustainable, I slip that in there too because there's something that causes change, even if it's successful, to either snap back or to go back and seek that previous state. It's hard to keep change in place. You have to be very intentional about it. So it needs to be successful and sustainable. I loved a book called Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us by a fellow named Daniel Pink. He's written a bunch of really great books. But this one really stood out for me. It's about engagement and motivation. And there are 3 human motivators. What are those? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll is not what I had in mind. He says it's mastery, it's autonomy, and meaning. Mastery, autonomy, and meaning. We love to learn things, we love to be good at things and feel some kind of mastery. That's a natural human thing. And autonomy is hugely important too. We need to be the boss of us. We need to feel like we have some power and autonomy. We just do. And then meaning. Does this have meaning? What is the meaning of this? We need to understand that. And all of those things, I would argue, are very related to the success or failure of a change effort, of change. When you think about, especially autonomy, if change is being done to you versus are you a stakeholder that is actually has ownership of this, of some part of the change, or at least you're aware of it and have been consulted. John Cotter, who I mentioned a little earlier, has an eight-stage process for creating major change. And I want to look at my notes just to be sure I get these right, but he's written a book that is a classic called Leading Change. First step is, and this is tips for leaders to successfully lead that sustainable change, the change that you want. First is establish a sense of urgency. Give them a line of sight of, this is why this is important. Here's the why. If we don't change, we're going to miss an opportunity. We're going to be overpassed or overtaken rather by our competitors. There's all kinds of ways that you can build urgency, sense of urgency. And it could be positive too. Let's strike while the iron is hot. Let's do this and take the lead. And then the next step is creating the guiding coalition. So this is where you bring in the stakeholders. This is where you bring in, you identify who they are and who is it that should be at the table at that time. You could bring them in, others in along the way, but being very thoughtful and mindful of having stakeholders involved. But building that coalition is hugely important. Develop a vision and strategy. People, I think, it seems like, will usually follow someone if they can be presented with a compelling vision of here's where we're going, here's what we want, here's why it's important. So having that compelling vision and strategy. Fourth one is communicating the change vision. And communicating this, again, here's the why, here's what's in it for you, the WIIFM. And communicating it continuously through all channels a lot. Maybe over-communicating, trying to reach everyone, because that consistency of communication eventually starts getting people believing it. If you don't think that the repetition is powerful, if you look at advertising and jingles, radio jingles are for different products, over and over again, as obnoxious as they are, they get into your head. Empowering broad-based action. So it's getting out of the way and empowering your people to go take broad-based action in support of this. The next one, number 6, is intriguing. Generating short-term wins. People like to have that hit of, we're making progress, a small win, a short-term win. And having a celebration and saying, this is what I'm talking about. This is moving in the right direction. I'm so proud of these people. We need a victory lap. let's have a celebration. So setting yourself up for having those and for noticing them and celebrating them. And do that along the way. And then number 7 is consolidating gains and producing more change. So you start building momentum, you start building on those gains and producing more change. And then finally, for the sustaining piece of it, is anchoring the new approach in the culture, because people can get caught up in something and you have the success, but it's so easy for them it's kind of like going back to sleep and drifting back. There's this undercurrent that's going to pull toward the old way. So by anchoring it in the culture, this new approach, and thinking of other ways that you can continue that, to build on that, it will be an enduring change. So let's pause a second and talk about that. So to conclude, we've talked about 4 areas related to change. There was the nature of change. There was why change efforts often fail. There was human nature in relation to change. And then there was leadership and change. And all this could be summed up by one of my favorite quotes. And so let me read this to you. Change is inevitable, and drama is optional. Reverend Deborah Johnson out in California said that. I was in a seminar and she said that. I wrote that down years ago. Change is inevitable, drama is optional. And to me that sums it up of change is going to happen. Change is happening. In all the different ways that we've described change. How you react to it, how you manage through it, how you lead through it is optional. There are choices involved. And so it's an invitation, I think, to acknowledging change is going to happen, it's inevitable, and to make conscious choices to take leadership and ownership and do the right thing to make this change sustainable. I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Good.